Hey, it's Damon. I hope that you feel, as I do, that the hundreds of interviews on the Who Am I Really podcast are a wealth of knowledge about the experiences of adopted people. You may also have heard me occasionally say that I've been doing some writing. Well, I'm working on book 2, based on the adoption experiences guests have shared with me on the show. I never thought I'd be writing another book, but it just feels like the right thing to do, and something that the adoption community can benefit from. I make time to write as much as I can about what I've learned from this incredible collection of adoption stories. My writing explores what it's like to grow up in adoption, our relationships with our adoptive families, the myriad catalysts that make us want to search for our birth families, various methods for searching, how adoption reunions unfold, and how we are impacted by the journey. That was truly an oversimplification of book 2, and I have to say, I'm really enjoying pouring myself into synthesizing our various adoption experiences and sharing our collective lessons learned. If this sounds like a book that you'll want to dig into, then go to whoamireallypodcast.com/book2 and add your email address to the list to stay up to date on the book's release. Again, go to whoamireallypodcast.com/book2. That's book and the number 2. I can't wait to share my insights with you. Okay, you ready? Let's go.
All of it started to make sense. When you say something isn't quite right, finding that piece of Granny explained why I was in Granny's care, why I didn't have a great relationship with my mother, and why my mother did not have a super great relationship with her mother. And it all stemmed from that incident.
Who am I?
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 This is Who Am I Really? A podcast about adoptees that have located and connected with their biological family members. I'm Damon Davis, and today you're going to meet Bobbi, who lives right here in Montgomery County, Maryland with me. Bobbi reached out as an ally to the adoptee community, but after we chatted, she realized something important about her own journey. She shared her tale of generational kinship adoption, the heartbreaking discovery that her beloved granny had likely endured an assault, and the DNA discoveries of multiple adoptees who were placed from her own family tree. This is Bobbi's journey. Bobbi grew up as an only child in her family, spending the first 14 years of her life in the Adams-Morgan area of Washington, D.C. Bobbi's maternal grandmother was her primary caregiver as a kid. She spent some weekends with her mom and her stepfather in Southeast D.C. until she was 14 years old, when she went to go live with her mother full-time. When I asked Bobbi why she was raised by her grandmother for all those years, she said,
My mom and my father was married. My father and my mother separated while she was pregnant with me. But my mother and father had already been living in the household with my grandmother. Born, he came back and they stayed together for about 3 months, and then they separated again permanently. And so that left me and my mom in the house with my grandmother. And then when my mom met my stepfather, she moved in with him, but I stayed with my grandmother.
when your mom met your stepfather, she moved in with her new second husband. You stayed at home with your grandmother. Gotcha. Do you have an understanding as to why you didn't go with your mom?
I think even though my mom was 26 when she had me, she was not prepared for a child. My mom didn't have the personality for a child. And I think my grandmother overruled her on taking me anywhere, because I was the first child that my grandmother actually raised from birth to tween age. So I think my grandmother wanted to keep me because I also reminded her of her last baby that she had and that she had to relinquish.
So your grandmother relinquished a child and had never raised a baby of her own. So when her granddaughter came around, that's you, and her and your mother, who you have said did not have the personality to be a mother, said she was going to live with her second husband, was a perfect match. Your
Hmm.
grandmother wanted to raise a baby because she'd never had a chance to do it before, and your mother didn't really want to be a mother, so she split. This is fascinating. Okay. Now, at what point did you know that your grandmother had relinquished a child? It wasn't until you discovered on DNA, huh?
Yes,
Okay,
I was 55, I believe.
gotcha.
Mhm.
Now, so tell me about what does it mean for your mother to not be basically the kind of person who should have been a mother? What do you mean by that?
I have this philosophy that every person is not meant to be a birth parent. Every person isn't meant to be a step parent. Some parent people are not meant to be adoptive parents. I think we all just have our roles that fit our personalities better. And my mother just she her role was to bring me into this world, but her role as a person was not to be a mother.
She
I
was a
have
vessel, not a
she was
parent.
she was right, exactly. I always
Really
thought of my
interesting.
grandmother more of my mom than my mom. Even though I call my mom and my grandmother Granny, I knew the distinction, but I was always closer to my grandmother.
Yeah, because she played the role. Your
Hmm.
mother had the title, but your
Right,
granny played the role.
right.
Understood. So, what was it like growing up in your grandmother's house? How was
Oh,
she as a parent?
she was great. She was wonderful because she was a young grandmother. When I came along, she was only 44. So she was a very young grandmother and a very hip grandmother. She was in spirit, she was younger than my mother because my mother had been raised by her grandmother who was much older. And so just totally different philosophies about things. So things that I would talk to my grandmother about um, as a young adult, I would never bridge those subjects with my mother, never ever, because just two totally different mindsets on everything. So Granny was, she was everything to me. So she was wonderful.
That's really interesting. And you said that you were raised by your grandmother and your mother was raised by her grandmother.
My granny had two children that I knew of. My mom and my mother's brother. They had different fathers. And so my mom was raised by her father and his mother, and my uncle was raised by his father and his mother. So my grandmother didn't really raise any children until I came along.
I know this is confusing, so let me try to clarify things a bit. Bobby's parents were married, brought her home to her maternal grandmother's home, then they broke up. When Bobby's mother, a woman who was not cut out to be a mother, found a new man, she moved in with the guy, leaving her daughter, Bobby, to be raised by her own mother. There are similarities between Bobby's story and her mother and uncle, as each of them were both raised by their respective fathers and their paternal grandmothers. Bobby's grandmother, raising Bobby, continued a generational pattern in her family tree. Now, I'm going to keep checking in with you here on the facts of Bobby's journey because it's going to get more complicated. You may be thinking to yourself that Bobby doesn't sound like an adoptee because she knows both of her parents. The truth is, she came to me as an ally, listening to the show because she has so many adoption discoveries in her own family tree. But listen to what happens next as I ask her about her childhood and what she was like as a kid. In the adoptee space, I often will ask somebody about how they were different from their adoptive parents, but what you have is basically a kinship adoption.
Mm-hmm.
So you technically are an adoptee, and
Well, I never thought about it like that, but
right, that's what this is. You are a kinship adoptee, and so what I would classically ask somebody who is an adoptee in the more traditional sense that we think of it, how are you different from your adoptive parents? I'm curious, how were you similar or different from your grandmother?
even though she had lived with my grandmother, for a while as a young adult and as a young married person, she didn't know a lot about my grandmother. So things that, as my grandmother got older, we had to step in to help take care of her. Things that I knew about my grandmother, my mother never knew. And things that I liked, my granny liked. So I could tell my mother, no, you can't do this because she won't like this, or those type of things. So I was very much more like my granny. I was more of a nerd growing up. I was always reading books and stuff and taking bike rides to Adams Morgan, Calorama Park, those type of things. I was very much, I had friends, but my friends was, lived in an apartment building. So I had friends in the apartment building,
Hmm.
and I didn't have any friends where my mother lived at because I was only there on the weekends,
Hmm.
during the school year. But I was just a normal, average kid, but very nerdy,
There's
very
nothing
nerdy,
wrong with that. My wife is a nerd, so she'll tell you proudly.
very
And
nerdy. And
there's another person that works for her at her office, and he thinks of himself as a black nerd too. And he got her a gift, and on the outside of the bag, he said, "From one blurred to another." It was really cute. Later in life, Bobby went to college, got married, and had 3 children. So recall that Bobby was an only child in kinship adoption under her grandmother's care. As we all know, our families have secrets, and frequently the children can tell something is off in the family. They know something isn't quite right, but what is being obscured is impossible to identify. You don't know what you don't know, but something doesn't feel quite right. As an adult, one of Bobby's coworkers, a woman of Guatemalan descent, had done an ancestry DNA test and told Bobby how fascinating her heritage was. The woman said her husband called her a mutt because she discovered that she has ties to indigenous people, Hispanic heritage, and connections back to areas of the Congo. Bobby was thinking she wanted some more exotic information about her heritage beyond domestic roots in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Bobby received her results in November of 2018, where she saw more far reaching connections to Ghana, Nigeria, Ireland, and the Balkans. Then she started looking at her relatives. Back then, Ancestry didn't grant users the close approximations of family relationships that it does today. All Bobby saw was,
first cousin to a close family match, I think is how it was worded. And the only words I saw, my mind saw, was first cousin. I just eliminated close family match because I'm only child. My father was a womanizer. I always knew that there could be, but it's just not clicking. So I just disregard close relative and look at first cousin. It's a woman. And I go, what? I don't know who you are. And I know all my first cousins because my mother has a brother. My father has had a sister and a brother. So I knew their kids. That was it. So I open it up and I look, and I didn't know anything about Cincy Morgans or anything. And I just figured one of my grandfathers had a child that nobody knew about, and this was that child's offspring. That's the only way I could get a first cousin that I don't know about. So anyway, the email to the person said, "Hey, I don't know who you are, and I know all my first cousins. I think you might be a hidden grandchild of one of my grandfathers. You know, here are their names, but I have no idea." So the next day, when I learned the website a little better, she showed up on my father's side, on his father's side, so on my paternal grandfather's side. And so I said, "Oh, okay. It's this grandfather who had a child that nobody knows about." And then the nerd, at that time, Ancestry had white pages, and you could read the white pages and find out what the Cindy Morgans meant and what the ranges meant and what they really meant when they said first cousin, close family to first cousin. And in reading that, it said, normally when it says first cousin, a close relative, is normally not a first cousin because it would normally say just first cousin. Normally, it's a sibling. And then it went into the centimorgans. And we share enough centimorgans. We're only like 200 or 300 centimorgans shy of being full siblings. So, so
Wow.
when I got the range, I was like, oh, yes, we do share a grandfather because we share a father.
Oh. And this is you're sitting by yourself
I'm saying,
analyzing the information. How did that hit you when you realized that?
well, it was, I had sent her the first email and I sent her a second one and said, hey, you belong on the Alexander side of my family. And then the third email I sent her was, yeah, we share a father. Yes, of course, we share a grandfather because we share a father. And it was like, I have a sister, and I always wanted a brother versus a sister. I have a sister. So she sent me an email and she said, I've been on here for 2 or 3 years, and I see that you've been on Ancestry for 6, 7, 8 years because I would do ancestry for my kids. So you're in Montgomery County. So when the kids are in second or third grade, they do this report on your family tree. So I had signed up for ancestry to do the family tree with the kids years ago. And I did the family tree 3 times on ancestry with 3 kids. And that part of the story will go with the other side of the story. So she sent me emails like, why hadn't we connected? And I was like, well, that's because I just took the DNA test. And she said in her email, which I didn't pick up on at first, she said, well, I think I'm on the right track. My DNA show that I belong to the Alexanders. And I'm like, okay, yeah, you belong to an Alexander. So the next day we actually spoke on the phone, and Damien, it was very, even though I knew that the DNA had proved that we were siblings, is when I heard her voice. It was absolutely no doubt because she sound and laughed like my father.
Really?
Yeah,
Wow.
it was absolutely no doubt. So while we're on the phone talking for the first time, I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe I have a sister. And she's like, but I've been looking for you for 30 years. I'm like, what do you mean you've been looking for me for 30 years?
Bobby's newfound half sister is an adoptee. When she was 20 years old, she decided to find her birth mother. While she was born in Washington, D.C., where adoption records are closed, for some reason the woman's records had been moved to Virginia, where adoption records are open. That relocation of her records was a key reason Bobby's half sister was able to locate her birth mother. When she located the woman, her natural question was, what about her birth father's identity? The woman said the man's name was Bobby, and he had another daughter, 2 years older than her, my guest, Bobbie. The woman went on to say that the man was missing a finger, just like Bobby's father.
So she said, you didn't know about me, but I knew about you. And that's
Wow.
why she did the DNA test, hoping that one day I would do the DNA test. So we connected. We're good. And so I'm 2 years older. I like to tell people genetics is really interesting. We both have flat feet. Neither one of us like eggs. I'm an accountant. She is a middle school, high school math teacher. So we have the whole number thing going. So I call myself the big little sister because I'm short and round. And she's tall and thin. She's tall like my our father and her mother. So I have a little sister.
So let's pause for a minute here.
Mhm.
This is amazing. Tell me how this feels to you. You have, one, discovered that somebody that you had accidentally written off as a cousin is actually a very close sibling within a couple of hundred centimorgans, number one. Number two, you've spoken with this person by phone and you have discovered some similarities in your story, and then you've discovered that she was adopted.
Yeah, she said, "Oh, I'm adopted." And I was just like, What?" It never even
Mhm.
dawned on me that I would have had a sibling that would have been adopted.
So what I think I'm hearing is your father conceived your half sister and did not parent her, and neither did her mother. That your sister was placed for adoption, and you discovered your half sibling and then realized that person is an adoptee out of your family.
Yep.
This is really fascinating. Wow. So, what was it like for you to meet her for the first time?
It was exciting. We actually met in my mother's and my father's hometown because she was living in South Carolina at the time, and my parents were from North Carolina. So she just drove up, and I drove down, and we met there, and we spent the whole weekend together, just the two of us. And she cried. I didn't cry, at least the emotional of the two of us. But she had a longer journey in searching for me.
That's fair. I'm really glad you pointed that out. You're right. This is a 30-year journey she's already told you that has
Mhm.
finally culminated in her finding you. And for you, this is an entirely new surprise.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I could see why you wouldn't necessarily be quite as emotional as she would have been, having looked for you and her biological family for years. This is
Mhm.
unbelievable. Did she tell you that she found any other siblings besides you?
No, so which is surprising, just knowing my father's history. It's just absolutely amazing that it's just the two of us. So both of us are in Ancestry, and we're also in 23andMe. And I've gone further than her, and I did the DNA for my heritage. Because you just never know what test somebody will take. And so far, 6 years later, we're still the only two,
Mm.
which is incredible.
Yeah, it's clearly blowing your mind.
It is just because of who my father was, just because of who he was.
Mm.
Like I was saying earlier, that my sister's birth mother was not happy because my father had told her partial truths. So she really didn't know who he really was. So my name is Bobby. I'm named after him. Bobby is not his real name. It's a nickname. His real name is George. His mother, my paternal grandmother, had gallbladder surgery when he was about 4 months old. So back in the 40s or late 30s, they would cut you from here to do a gallbladder surgery. They didn't have laparoscopic surgery then. So it was a
So
four
they
month,
would open you up.
they would open you up. So
Mm.
it's a 3, 4 month recovery period. So my paternal great grandmother said, "Well, I'll take the baby, my father, and keep him while you recover," to my grandmother. Well, my great grandmother decided to keep him. She never relinquished him back to her daughter. And so she didn't think he looked like a George. She nicknamed him Bobby.
Wow.
So he grew up as Bobby, but his name was George. He was born George Alexander. And my great grandmother last name was Funderburk. So he grew up in the country in North Carolina. So when he went to school as Bobby Funderburk, but that wasn't his name. So when he graduated from high school, he decides to go into the service, and he has to enlist with his correct name, his government name, which is George Alexander. So my sister's birth mother was like, "Oh, his name is Bobby Funderburk, and he's this and he's that." And I'm like, "No, that's like an alias." So it's an alias. This is his real name. I'm named after his nickname because my mom didn't want to name me Georgiana, Georgina, Georgette. So I got Bobby, and me and my sister tried to explain to her the centimorgans, and there's no mistaking in his DNA. And I was like, besides, how many Bobbies do you know that have a missing finger? So when he was in Korea, he lost a finger. So I never knew of him to have, he was born with 10 fingers, but I never knew him to have 10 fingers. Like, how many? She's like, "Oh, no, I think he was missing 2 fingers." It's like,
She was
but
searching. Yeah.
she
Wow.
was, she did not know who he truly was. And I told her, it's not your fault. My sister was born in May of 1966. I have a wedding picture of him and my stepmother of May of 1966. And he married her as Bobby Funderburg. So, because he
Under
was
the
still
alias.
married to my mother as George Alexander. So when there's no other kids, I'm just flabbergasted that there's no other kids.
So wait a minute. You said he was married to your mother at that time as George Alexander, and you have a picture of him at the
Married
time of your half sister's birth getting married under his
alias Bobby.
alias,
Hmm.
Bobby
Fun.
Funderburg.
Mhm.
Woo, boy.
Yeah, he was a long distance truck driver.
Oh, yeah, I see why you think otherwise. Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
it's like, yeah, I'm very shocked that we're the only two.
So
Just
for you, the Ancestry DNA door is still wide open.
oh, I check it every day.
Oh, my goodness.
I
Wow.
do. I literally check it every day because I was not looking for a sibling. I was not looking for any of this. I was looking to see where my ancestors came from. That's all I wanted to know. But
Mm, mm,
since
mm.
I got a sister, I was like, well,
Okay, I think it's time to check in to make sure you're following along. When Bobby's birth father was born, he was given the name George. When his mother had gallbladder surgery the old fashioned way, where they opened up her body cavity, her mother took Bobby's father into her care while her daughter recovered. His grandmother didn't like his given name, George, so she changed it to Bobby, and he lived by that alias in every way, except when he enlisted in the military, thus making it hard for Bobby's half sister to find their father, Bobby. When I asked my guest, Bobby, about her daily dip into the Ancestry DNA platform to see what new relatives she has, she said she scrutinizes every cousin because they could be way more than she was expecting, like her unexpected sister discovery. Which brings us to the second part of Bobby's journey. Bobby was online one day when she encountered another full cousin match. Staring at the woman's photo, Bobby could see the woman looked just like relatives on her maternal side of the family, nearly identical to a third cousin. Upon closer examination, Bobby could see this new person indeed matched with her maternal side and with her uncle's daughter, who also had a DNA profile online. Bear in mind, Bobby's birth mother and her mother's brother, her uncle, have two different fathers, which convolutes things a little bit.
just to make things easier for you, I'm one of those few people in the world who do not have full first cousins. All of my first cousins are half first cousins.
You think that made it easier?
I don't know what was going on in North Carolina in the late 30s and early 40s, but I have no full first cousins.
That is astonishing. So you're online.
So I'm online and I see, and again, it tells me first to second cousin. And look, she matches up with my uncle's daughter, which is a half first cousin. Oh, this is really strange. So at one point in my life, my mom had told me that she had been pregnant with twins and they were stillborn. Okay. But, it's that feeling that something just isn't right in life. It's just, I don't know what it is, but something isn't right. So in my mind, I'm thinking maybe she had the twins and gave them up for adoption. That's my thought process. So when
After making this discovery of a cousin.
right, and even before then, I thought maybe the twins were given up for adoption, because again, something just wasn't right in our family. Didn't know what it was, but something wasn't right.
So you didn't necessarily believe her when she said that her twins were stillborn.
I still
Gotcha.
don't. I still don't. So when I see this cousin and I send her emails like, hey, again, I know my first cousins, don't know you. Matter of fact, you share more DNA with my uncle's daughter than you do with me. So Who are you? And by the way, I think my mother may have given away some twins. Could you be one of the twins? I don't know. So is there anybody in your family adopted? And that was the big question, because where are these people coming from? So normally when you send out an email on Ancestry, most people don't check Ancestry every day. So it could be 2, 3, 4 days before, or even longer before they get back to you. But she got back to me within 15 minutes. And she said, "Oh, I don't know anything about my mother's history, but my mother was adopted. We don't know anything. Only thing we know that it was scandalous, and her birth mother gave her away to this family." So I said, "Well, we need to talk so we can figure this out."
Yeah.
So we talked the very next day, and she gave me the information that she had. And at this point, this is early 2019, I've become an expert on DNA. And so I'm looking at the centimorgans, I'm comparing them to mine, I'm comparing them to my uncle's daughter. And I say, I don't know how this is, because my granny only had 2 children. But the DNA is telling me, because the only thing me and my uncle's daughter share is granny, because we don't share grandfather. Granny is the only common denominator. And I said, somehow you belong to my granny. I don't know how. So she said, well, her mother is deceased. My aunt is deceased. But her mother had told her that the only information that she had was that the woman who gave her away was a black woman, and that the father of the baby was either white or half white. So I looked at my cousin's DNA, and I was like, no, it looks like your mother was half white, because my cousin is a third Caucasian. And I was
Okay.
like, your grandfather, whoever he is, white.
Bobbi, now an expert in DNA and family connections, started looking deeper into this new cousin's relationship to the family. But before we dig into that, I just want to remind you that Bobbi had 3 kids who went through school, all doing family tree projects for class. That was the original reason Bobbi had an account on the Ancestry platform before having submitted a DNA sample. She recalled that anytime her kids did the family tree project, she would come across a unique record that sparked curiosity. Every time she saw that record, Bobbi blew it off. So you were doing genealogy research, but you had not actually submitted your DNA.
Correct.
So every time your children had a family tree project at school, you would go on ancestry.com and do genealogy research. And
Yes.
you would frequently come across this record
Just
that had your 2 grandparents' names on it and a random child, but because you had not been exposed to this discovery of a distant relative, it didn't click for you that
no.
this is something to dig into. It was just
It, it was
random
it
weirdness.
was this. My granny's name was Minnie. My grandfather's name was Benny. They're common names in the South.
Yeah, right.
And
Wow.
it's just, and even the child's name was common, because the child's name was the same name as my grandfather's mother. So it never even dawned on me that birth record really meant something to me. I would just skip over, go, oh, there's that record again, and just go skip right on past it. So when I did the search for my aunt, and I expanded the year, because her daughter had given me a birth year of 1942, but I couldn't find her in 1942. But when I expanded it for a whole year from 1941 to 1942, I found my aunt in 1941. Same birthday, but a different year. And that's very important. When I found her, I opened up the record, and there was my grandparents' name as the parents. And I was like, oh my God, how many times have I gone past this record and just ignored it, because I had no clue that there had been another child.
Yeah.
So, as
And this is Granny's child.
This is Granny's child. This is Granny's child. So as we dug and everything, and then we realized that we know that there's a white father versus my grandfather, then it was like, none of this makes any sense. So what we came up with was either Granny was assaulted and this pregnancy came about, or she worked in a home. This is 1940 when the baby was conceived, or early 1941. So my grandmother was a domestic, so she was working in a home of a white family. And she had been working in that home for a while because my uncle was named after this white family's son. So, and
Wow.
and then when my mom came along, she didn't name my mom after their daughter. They wanted her to name my mom after their daughter, but my granny didn't like the daughter's name. So my mom didn't get named after their daughter, but this family, the husband was a captain in the Salvation Army. And my granny said they always took care of my mom for Christmas and holidays. My granny didn't have to buy anything for my mom. They always took care of her. So the only thing we could come up with was that it was a random assault by a white man, or it could have been this husband, father in this household that decided, I've taken care of your child for 2 or 3 years since birth. Now it's time to take care of me. And that could have happened. We just don't know.
So, in your genealogical research, you've not found any linkages back to this family that your granny worked for. You know the names?
I don't know the names.
Ah, so they could be on the tree and you just wouldn't even know it was them.
Wouldn't even know.
Oh, that's interesting. I
Uh,
see. So, thus the confusion as to whether this was an assault by a stranger or
for
a assault
okay,
by a familiar person. I got you.
correct. So we just don't know. I was having a hard time dealing with it because it was like, oh my God, somebody hurt my granny. And then my granny had to give away her child
Yeah.
because of the circumstances of the birth.
Bobby's maternal aunt, the mother of her newly discovered cousin, had a sister who was also adopted into that family, the woman's adopted sister. When Bobby's cousin spoke with her mother's adopted sister about the situation with her own mother, her aunt by adoption shared that her mom, the adoptee Bobby's granny gave away, always knew Granny's first name, but she didn't know her last name. The woman searched for Bobby's granny, but when her granny left North Carolina for Washington, D.C., and got married, her name changed, making her that much harder to find. Bobby said her aunt's adoption was not a legal adoption. It was more like her granny knew someone who could help her out and asked them to take her baby. But remember how Bobby said she found her long-lost aunt's birthday in records a year earlier than the birth year she had been searching for? Listen to what Bobby uncovered as to the likely reason why.
My aunt's adopted sister said that my aunt came into the family when she was about a year old. So remember, I could not find her birth record with the birth year that they had given me. So they started all her official paperwork when they got her, which meant that she was about a year old.
She's a year younger than she is in her physical life.
Yes.
Interesting.
It,
Wow.
and so this adopted sister told me that the story that they had gotten from the adopted mother was my grandmother, my granny, went to her and said, please take this baby. This baby isn't my husband's, and he has threatened to kill the baby and to kill me if I don't relinquish this child. And I was just devastated. I knew my grandfather could be a jerk, but come on, dude. You've lived with this baby for a year. It's named after your mother, but I guess he figured, well, that's it. They were young. I think my grandfather was probably at the most 23, and my grandmother was like 22 when my aunt was born. So who knows what he was thinking, but I felt so bad for my grandmother because if it was an assault or if it was this man that she worked for, she could not tell my grandfather in 1941, North Carolina, because if he had gotten upset, well, which he would have, and decided to act out towards this person, he literally could have been killed.
So if she had revealed what had happened to her, her husband would have gone after the guy.
Right. Either way, he would have either been in jail or he would have been dead. And then my mother would not have had a father.
Hmm.
Granny would have been on her own again. So I think she just hoped that the baby was by my grandfather's. But most African American babies come out looking white and then they get darker. That didn't happen with my aunt.
Yeah. So it became clear. Thus, the year in the house, trying to give the baby time to change colors. I see. Got you. This is so fascinating. Oh my gosh.
So baby didn't change colors. Baby has to go. She gives the baby away. She stays with my mother and my grandfather for maybe another year or two. And because my grandfather was abusive, and she finally left, and she left my mother and my uncle in North Carolina, and she came to DC. Her parents had already migrated to DC, so she came here. That's why I'm here.
Mm.
That's why eventually
So
my mother and father eventually landed here. When I found out about my granny, I had to go see a therapist because I was just devastated that my granny had to endure what she did. Not only just dealing with an abusive husband, dealing with what happened to her to have had this baby and then to have to relinquish that baby because of what had happened to her. And
wow.
it was devastating for me. I was just like, I just cannot believe it. But all of it started to make sense. When you say something isn't quite right, finding that piece of Granny explained why I was in Granny's care, why I didn't have a great relationship with my mother, and why my mother did not have a super great relationship with her mother. And it all stemmed from that incident because my grandmother left my mother at age 5 to be raised by her father and grandmother.
Wow.
So, and then when I come along, I think there was some jealousy between for my mother because when I come along, I'm a white baby and I literally does not change colors until I'm 2 years old. And my granny just took me in and it was like, she's mine.
So you very much resembled the child that she had relinquished years ago
Yeah.
under duress, potentially after an attack. Wow. May I ask you, Bobby, as I've been listening to your story, you've highlighted the numerous kinship adoptions that have happened with grandparents. It's more than once. You've talked about it with your father, your mother, your granny. It sounds like it's rampant in your family. But as I heard you describe it, you raised your own kids. You
Yes.
had 3.
I was the first in my granny family. I was the first one to raise my kids.
And
My
what do you
granny
think
did
of
not
when
raise
you
her kids. My mom did not raise me. My father was not raised by his mother.
and what do you think of when you reflect on that, breaking this familial cycle of kinship adoptions versus actually being the mother?
I think I have a closer relationship with my um, kids than I ever had with my mom. I went to live with my mom full time when I was between 13 and 14. Um, and it was always a difficult relationship because I think my mom thought when I came to live with her, I think somewhere in the back of her mind, she was getting her baby back. Even though I wasn't an adult, I was already raised. There was no molding me and shaping me. Granny had already done that. I
No
was,
coddling, none of
no,
that lovey-dovey, "I need you, mom." At
no,
14, when you come into somebody's house, you're at a point of striving for independence, actually. It's
yep,
quite the opposite.
yep, yep.
Wow.
So, yeah, I think that relinquishment changed the dynamics. Uh,
Yeah. So what do you think of then in terms of being the person who broke that cycle in the family of generational trauma, right?
I didn't give it much thought while I was raising my children, but I do remember with my firstborn, who just turned 30 on Monday, that my mom, when I had him, I was having a hard time finding daycare because both my husband and I work. And daycare is just expensive. I don't care what year it is. She said, "Well, you can bring them here. You can just come get them on the weekends." Well, that's what she did with me. And I was like, "I don't think so." And my ex husband was like, "No, I don't think so. We'll figure it out." I think if I had been a single mother, I may have taken her up on that.
Wow.
But because I was married, it was okay, we'll figure it out.
Mhm.
So I didn't consciously think, oh, I'm going to raise my children. I think it just happened.
And it could have just not happened, it sounds like,
Yeah.
had the situation been slightly different.
Well, even though I raised my children, my primary caretaker for my children was my granny from 6 weeks until they went into pre K. So my children had a very good relationship with their great grandmother. Because I think my oldest was a 20 something when my grandmother died. So they had a long time with her. But she was the primary caretaker while I was working. So again, I think my mom had issues because she couldn't even be the grandmother.
Oh, so the kids, it didn't click for me until you just said that your children, their primary caregiver was their great grandmother. Wow. So she didn't even get that privilege either. This is fascinating. Okay.
She didn't get, they knew her, their grandmother. But again, my mother was not that personality. That personality could have developed because she was never given the opportunity to be a mother or a grandmother.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually, that none of us are born as parents.
No.
When my son was born, I wasn't just I didn't have professional skills as a father. I developed them by my day-to-day interaction with him. Similarly, if your mother gave birth to you and you were, for all intents and purposes, swept away by your grandmother, then she would not have the skill set to have bonded with you. If every
Mhm.
time she picked up the baby, you were scooped away to be in your grandmother's arms or what have you, I could see how she would not have developed the skill set to have bonded with you. And yeah, there's a lot of trauma in there. I could see why this was a very difficult family situation for a lot of people. You've described a lot of it. It's hard to hear, but you sound like you've
I'm
recovered. You've done therapy, you've raised your children.
I raised my children when my mother got ill. I moved her into my house. She just passed this past October, so she was living in my home for almost 5 years.
I'm sorry. Wow.
Thank you. And so I feel that I've done everything that I was supposed to do for her. Yes, she was my mother, but my granny was
Mom,
my mom.
how was it to be a caregiver for your mother
Oh,
when you guys weren't that close?
it was difficult. It was very difficult. I used to tell people that it was like having an 82, 80-year-old toddler. They have a mind of their own and they have a will of their own. There are certain things that they can't do, but like a toddler, they think they can do it and they're going to do it. So it was hard.
Yeah,
It
I'll
was
bet.
very difficult.
Yeah, I can imagine. Wow, Bobby. Well, I'm so glad you reached out. When I first read your submission, I thought to myself, but this person's not an adoptee, but she's got adoptee stories. This is going to be fascinating. And then in the first 5 minutes, we discover basically you are an adoptee.
Yeah, I had never thought about it like that. I had never thought about it like that.
Yeah, you absolutely were. And again, just to hear the generational trauma and across the family lines too, paternally and maternally,
Hmm.
is really tough. But I'm really glad to hear that you've taken the time to build on yourself, right? You heard about your grandmother's trauma. You went to get some therapy to get over and through what you've now come to understand happened to her. And that was super smart because it could have damaged your relationship with other people. And
Hmm.
so for you to have taken those steps is really incredible. So, and I'm glad to hear that you also broke the cycle of what was happening in your family. So thank you so much, Bobby, for being here. This was really fascinating. I appreciate you opening up your family story to us.
Thank you. It's a doozy.
It really is. It really is. All right. Well, you take care. All the best to you. Okay.
Okay, will do. Thank you.
All right. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Hey, it's me. When Bobby first reached out to share her family story, I tried to go in with an open mind, recognizing that the adoptee community has many allies, and they also have stories to tell. It was totally unexpected that Bobby would reveal that she too was a kinship adoptee. I found it remarkable that Bobby would have so many grandmother kinship adoptions across her family tree. It was really tough to hear that the granny she loved so much had probably suffered a trauma that got her pregnant, and she was later forced to place her child for adoption. That trauma in her past explains a lot about her attachment to Bobby, whom she loved as if she were her daughter. But what's also remarkable about Bobby's story is, when we go on to platforms like Ancestry DNA, we never know what we'll discover. Frequently, we discount the cousin relations that we have, but sometimes they can turn out to be far more than we ever expected. I'm Damon Davis, and I hope you found something in Bobby's journey that inspired you, validates your feelings about wanting to search, or motivates you to have the strength along your journey to learn, who am I really? Oh, and don't forget to keep tuning in to hear about how my next book is going. To stay in the loop, go to whoamireallypodcast.com/book2. That's book and the number 2.